Hello, fellow bibliophiles, and welcome back to Blatantly Bookish, and welcome back to Vlogmas. I'm Marissa, and today I want to finally share some of the books that I read in the months of October and November with you. Someone recently commented on one of my Vlogmas videos asking what I was reading, and I realized that was a spectacular question actually, because I haven't talked about what I've been reading on my channel for far too long. So I'm here to fix that finally today. I read 4 books in the month of October, all Victorian for Victober, of course, and I read 4 books in the month of November as well. Only 2 of those, though, actually ended up being nonfiction for Nonfiction November, because I felt a really strong pull back to fiction halfway through the month. One of the books I read in October was The Water Babies by Charles Kingsley. It's a children's book about a young chimney sweep who slips in a stream, falls asleep, and is reborn as a water baby, which is a childlike water sprite of sorts. In his new form, he embarks on a wild adventure where he meets all sorts of sea creatures and tries to rescue his former employer from a fate worse than death. It's a wonderfully quirky, albeit rather dated story. I actually discussed it in full detail in the context of Victorian children's literature in a Victober video, which I will link below if you want to hear more of my thoughts on this childhood classic. But the highlight of my Victober this year was The Half-Sisters by Geraldine Jewsbury. I absolutely loved this book. It centers around 2 half-sisters, as the title suggests. There's Alice, who lives a very conventional and respectable life, but is trapped in her marriage to a husband who doesn't encourage her or appreciate her intellectual capabilities, and she's just relegated to this dull domestic existence. And then there is Alice's illegitimate, half-Italian, half-sister, Bianca, who makes her way in the world first as a circus performer and then as an actress. The book examines the sisters' contrasting lives and fates. I personally found Bianca to be the far more interesting sister, but I think that's simply because Victorian literature is full of Alice-like figures. They're full of women who are pure and childlike and just the angel in the house character, you know, the conventional woman who has very little agency. Bianca, though, is the interesting rarity. The Half-Sisters is rather radical for its time, and it looks at women's roles in the Victorian era in really interesting proto-feminist almost ways. Like I said, it is so rare to find a character like Bianca in a Victorian novel. She finds purpose and takes pride in her work, despite the profession's really seedy reputation. And the way the book explores morality is fascinating, because you have Bianca, who is deemed by other characters as immoral simply based on her profession. But ironically, she's possibly the most moral and respectable character in the book. And it's really some other figures who seem like upstanding, respectable people on the surface who represent vice and deceit and immorality in the book. The book explores the complex nuances of Victorian femininity exceedingly well. The writing struck me as rather modern and easy to read for a Victorian novel, and I simply can't understand why Geraldine Jewsbury's work is not more popular. She had a prominent literary career in her time too, so I just struggle to understand why she is so forgotten. She reviewed works of Trollope and George Eliot and all of the famous Victorian authors that we read and talk about today. Dickens commissioned her to write 17 short stories, and she was friends with some famous people of the time like Thomas Carlyle and John Ruskin. She never married, and towards the end of her life, she was actually granted a government pension in acknowledgement of her contributions to literature. So seriously, why is her work out of print? I just can't figure it out. Can we bring it back somehow? Because I would love to read some of her other works if I can figure out a way to get a hold of them. I also read 2 on a Tower by Thomas Hardy in Victober as part of the Stitch and Knit read-along hosted by Kate Howe and Natalie from Curious Reader. Is this my favorite work of Hardy's? Absolutely not. But it was a really fun book to read, and I was grateful to be able to discuss it with such an engaging group of book lovers. So thank you to those of you who were a part of that read-along. Two on a Tower is sensationalist fiction about a privileged older woman named Lady Constantine who completely disregards all the rules of social propriety and falls in love with a younger man, this aspiring astronomer named Swithin St. Cleeve. This book is so sappy and melodramatic that I enjoyed knitting and laughing at it immensely. The thing is, I don't know if it was actually meant to be funny. I think there's a bit of a disconnect between a modern reader's interpretation of the book and how someone in the Victorian period would have read it. Because would a Victorian reader find the characters' reactions and dialogue so over the top and humorous like I did? I think a Victorian reader would certainly be more shocked by the plot of the book than a modern reader. A previously married, wealthy woman of 29, which is not old, by the way, taking a romantic interest in a young 20-year-old who has yet to make his fortune, is supposed to be incredibly scandalous. But I think that the improprieties in the age and the power dynamic, as well as the frankness and freedom that the couple enjoys in their relationship, just don't translate into the same sort of soapy, melodramatic scandal. For me, the scandal and suspense morphed into comedy. I did really enjoy the focus on astronomy in the book, though, and how the beauty and awe of the natural world, the stars and planets, are contrasted with the petty relationship problems and societal pressures that are placed on our main characters. This was actually a very fun book to read, but the ending was a massive disappointment. It was as if Hardy got bored of the characters and thought, what is the quickest way I can possibly wrap this up and just stop writing? So the quick and sloppy way that Hardy ends this book left me with a lot of questions, and I really don't know whether the main conflict of the plot was ever resolved. I'm not going to go into details because I don't want to spoil the book, but it seemed relatively unclear whether Lady Constantine's good reputation and standing in society was ultimately maintained. So anyway, surprisingly, I enjoyed this book, but I think I would only recommend it to people who are very familiar with Victorian literature and its conventions, so they can appreciate how this book attempts to diverge a bit from those standards. And last but not least, in the month of October, I reread Jane Eyre on audiobook. This is my very used, beat-up version of Jane Eyre, but this isn't actually what I read from this time around. But anyway, Jane Eyre is one of my favorite books of all time, and it's always such a pleasure to revisit it in any format. It's a coming-of-age story of an outcast orphan named Jane Eyre, and we follow Jane's life with her neglectful aunt and cousins to Lowood Charity School, where she survives despite horrific hardships, and on to Thornfield Hall, where Jane becomes a governess for a charming little girl named Adele. But something seems a bit off at Thornfield Hall, and Jane begins to unravel the mysteries of her employer's past while trying to secure the happiness that she deserves. Jane is just an old friend of mine and a character who I feel a strange kinship with. I always admire her perseverance, her tenacity, and her integrity, and I love the psychological complexity of the characters that Bronte creates. I fell in love again with my favorite scenes, and as always, when reading an old favorite, I discovered new facets to the work that I love so much. My feelings for Mr. Rochester vacillate over the years. He used to be a literary crush of mine, but over time I've definitely soured to his character. On this reading, I found him to be repugnant as ever, and I thought more about his penchant for deception. Why does Mr. Rochester willfully hide so much from Jane? He seems to take delight in deceiving her, and does it multiple times throughout the book. I have more nuanced thoughts about specific scenes at this point, and I do not want to spoil my favorite scenes for those who haven't read the book. So if I'm keeping it spoiler free, I have to stop there. But if you haven't read Jane Eyre, I highly, highly recommend that you pick it up. It's a fantastic, accessible introduction to Victorian literature, and there's a good reason why so many people adore it. And on to November. I started out November with Mudlark by Lara Maiklem. I didn't know what mudlarking was before picking up this book, but I quickly learned that it's the act of searching through the mud along the riverbed of any tidal river. So any river with a tide, but most commonly the Thames in London. And it's the act of pulling out objects and artifacts from the river. So historically it was a profession. People in the 18th and 19th centuries would forage for things that they could sell or reuse, and they actually made their livelihood off of what they could find in the mud. Now it's more of a hobby, and this book, Mudlark, is all about Lara Maiklem's experiences mudlarking in the Thames. Each chapter is titled after a different location along the river, and it's just such a wonderful, rambling adventure down the river's past and present. There are random snippets of London's past as Lara analyzes and divulges the history of the objects she finds, but it also focused very heavily on Lara's own experiences and thoughts, which I actually wasn't expecting. The memoir sections were written very well, but I didn't care about the author nearly as much as I did about the history of the objects she found or about the intrigue of mudlarking itself. Still, I learned a lot of fun facts and tidbits of information from this book. Apparently, the Japanese soda bottles, the ones with the little marble in them, I think they're called ramen, they're not Japanese at all. They're a Victorian invention called cod bottles, and the Thames foreshore is littered with them. I was also particularly intrigued by the story of a book printer who created the long-lost Dove type. He invented this typeset which he believed could reduce God to a page of visible type. And instead of letting his business partner get his hands on the typeset, he threw it away into the Thames. Lara shares stories about her collections of pipes and shards of pottery and coins, handmade pins, and even modern things like engagement rings and people's ashes. The stories and the information that these objects share with us is fascinating, as was this book. I also read The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin for Nonfiction November. It's the first James Baldwin I've read, and it's comprised of 2 essays. The first one, My Dungeon Shook, is rather short, and the second one, Down at the Cross, is the majority of the book. The first essay is a letter to Baldwin's nephew, and it's about how America's systemic racism is devastating to the Black man. It tries to prepare his nephew for the inherent limitations that he'll face solely because of his skin color. Baldwin reinforces that his nephew is not the problem, that he doesn't need to become like white people, but that he must learn to accept them. The second essay in The Fire Next Time focuses more on religion and its relationship to race. First, Baldwin shares his own coming-of-age story and his own fraught relationship with religion. He expresses his concern that he is hypocritical of being a preacher and struggling with his own faith at the same time. And his faith is shaken because he identifies the church and his religion as perpetuating systemic racism and hatred. It surprised me how readable this book was, despite its density and the complexity of its ideas. It also surprises me how relevant Baldwin's insights about America are today, still. I wish his work was dated, but it really isn't. It's still part of today's discussion, and I think that's why so many authors have responded to Baldwin with their own work. Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me is even more impressive and impactful now that I've read Baldwin's work. And I just want to continue thinking about Baldwin's ideas and continue the conversation by reading The Fire This Time at some point, which is a series of essays collected by Jesmyn Ward, and which sadly I didn't get to reading in Nonfiction November. Baldwin's work is a foundation for understanding and addressing race in America, and I don't know why I hadn't read it earlier. Honestly, it should be required reading in schools in America. Baldwin's voice is just so powerful that I have to give you a taste of it in at least one quote. It demands great spiritual resilience not to hate the hater whose foot is on your neck, and an even greater miracle of perception and charity not to teach your child to hate. Then I switched back to fiction and I read And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie. I love Agatha Christie mysteries, and this is perhaps my favorite that I've read so far. It's about a group of 10 strangers who are invited as guests for the weekend to a private island off the coast of Devon. They were all assembled there under various pretenses, and it soon becomes clear that they collectively don't actually know who owns this house or who brought them all together. It turns out that they have one important thing in common. They are each marked to be murdered. And over the course of the weekend, they begin to drop one by one, each murdered according to a famous nursery rhyme. So who invited them, who is murdering them, and who can they trust? This book is everything that I love about a good mystery. Psychological intrigue, creepy suspenseful atmosphere, lots of detail, and complex intricacies. But when I read this book, I had the wildest sensation of déjà vu. I didn't know the ending, but the plot just felt all too familiar to me. And that's because this kind of scenario, where a whole bunch of strangers are being picked off one by one, has been heavily integrated into pop culture. The Clue movie, which I love, definitely owes a lot to this book. And I didn't even mind that feeling of déjà vu because I still didn't know the ending, and because the book added a lot more psychological depth to these characters than I had ever experienced in similar storylines. And last but not least, I read Piranesi by Susanna Clarke this month. This book was a highly anticipated read of mine, and it did not disappoint me. It was such a unique and engaging read. Susanna Clarke has created this wonderful and complex world that I just loved getting lost in. The vivid descriptions of a house with endless rooms whose walls are lined with intricate sculptures held my attention, and I loved exploring that world. But the real wonder of this book is how the story unravels around us. There are so many mysteries to make sense of, and so many details to piece together along with our main character. And the experience I had reading this book and making sense of the plot alongside Piranesi was so enchanting. The tone of the book and the atmosphere it described reminded me of an image which at first I thought was by M.C. Escher, but when I looked up Escher's work, I couldn't find it. And eventually I realized that what I had in mind was actually the Carceres, or the prison series of etchings that I had learned about in art history. And the artist was Giovanni Battista Piranesi. So obviously this isn't a coincidence. I just happened to forget this art history name. Piranesi was an Italian classical archaeologist and architect and artist who did these elaborate etchings that I was thinking of. And I think just being aware of his work adds another layer to this book. This book reads like part fantasy, part mystery, part nature journal, and it's just a wonderful read. I love the way it explores themes of religion and spirituality and how they relate to science and progress and the quest for knowledge. And I also love the symbolism of the albatross. In fact, many thematic aspects of Piranesi remind me of Romanticism and the Romantic poets, specifically Coleridge's The Ancient Mariner and Blake's Songs of Innocence and Experience. I was just amazed at how this not very long book evoked so many philosophic thoughts and allusions to other works, and yet would still be enjoyable and rich without all that knowledge. And I'm sure there are also allusions that I completely missed and that went over my head. As much as I fell head over heels in love with this book, I will say that it's a weird book, and it won't be for everyone, and I had a bit of trouble getting into it at first myself. I think things really picked up for me in part 3 around page 80 or so, but once I got into it, this book was just so amazing. And I think it really does have a little something for a lot of different types of readers. I'd recommend it if you like quirky books, mysteries, fantasy, dark academia, and also if you just like beautifully written nature prose, because I think it has something for that type of reader as well. So yes, have you read any of these books that I've talked about so far? Did you enjoy them? I would love to talk with you guys about any of these books in the comments down below. And until next time, I look forward to seeing you in another video soon. Bye!